to this computer, so I won't forget. Right, this is the 34th Academia Bessarion meeting, and today is going to be on, let's see if I can get it to advance. It always gets stuck, and there we are. It's going to be on Santa Maria Nuova Hospital and the English Cemetery in Florence. I was meant to have given this talk last month, but I was actually incarcerated as a patient in Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, and I didn't have access to the PowerPoint slides or anything at that point, and I was rather desperate. And it was a rather difficult diagnosis. It's all a bit iffy. So this is really a kind of swan song. But Alex and I have decided that we will end the Academia Bessarion at this point, but continue with conferences for contemplatives, sort of modeled on John Cassian's conferences, which were held in the late classical, early medieval period on monastic contemplation, but for the aspect of women and as a sense of spiritual healing for our culture today. And I have remembered to record it. And I wanted to begin with this piece of pottery, which we found in the English cemetery. It's from Santa Maria Nuova Hospital with its emblem of the crutch. And we have many of these pieces. I've got at least three pieces of this, which for little cups for feeding the patients in the hospital. And its form is also the Jewish and Franciscan tau, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and which appears on the crown of the Madonna of Mercy in the Begala. And here we see it. Remember that in the book of Exodus, when the plagues are visited upon the Egyptians, the angel places on each of the Hebrew houses the letter tau. So the angel of death passes over those houses, as well as it being the symbol of death. It is also the resurrection, the salvation from death. And in this image in the Begalo, which was also originally the building for the Misericordia, the association whose members buried the dead and cared for the sick and so forth. Of the 7 acts of mercy, one of them is Infirmus eram et visitatis me. I was ill and you visited me. And this actually happened when I was in Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. I couldn't access I didn't have my cell phone with me. And I was desperately trying to make contact with the people who were meant to be organizing the English cemetery and so forth. And I woke up in my hospital bed, and there was Terence Ward looking at me, and also Katja beside me. And they were visiting me because I'd managed to get one of the visitors in the ward to put a note on the Cancello gate of the cemetery that I was incarcerated in the hospital after having gone there to emergency pronto soccorso. Now, Monna Tessa, who's Beatrice and Folco Portinari and Dante Alighieri, Nuova, all were involved with Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. Dante would become a member of the Arte dei Medici e Speziali, and for that he would have studied medicine at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. So this is something I had neglected to put into my book on Dante, but which should be there, and I'm hoping I can include it now. Monna Tessa, who was Beatrice's nurse, she helped found the hospital, persuaded Folco Portinari to do so in 1288. And this is her effigy, and also with the tablet saying that she had carried out this work. And their dates are 1289, 1290, when Beatrice Portinari dies, possibly following childbirth. There's this wonderful manuscript by Marco di Bartolomeo Rustici, Dimostrazioni dell'andata a viaggio al Santo Sepolcro e Monte Sinai, ho lasciato la lettera N, in 1427 and 1427, in which he draws the Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. There was a sense in Florence that it was also Jerusalem, as well as the classical sense of it being the new Rome and the new Athens, which would be the pagan Renaissance aspect. But more profoundly, one senses from the Rucellai beautiful architectural model of the Holy Sepulchre at their palace, that it is profoundly Jerusalem and also Nazareth of the Annunciation and Bethlehem of the birth of Jesus. This is when Santa Maria Nuova Hospital was acknowledged by the Pope, and we see this painting showing what it was like originally. And also here in the later painting reconstructing what its medieval form had been, with its cloisters and its church of Sant'Egidio. And this is a late 17th century engraving of it. And this is what it was like during COVID, with the COVID tents to check you before you entered, to make sure you didn't carry the disease with you, as also had been the case with the plague and so forth in Florence. And this is the map where you show coming from the station, the baptistry, the Duomo, you go down the Via degli Oriolo, you go up the Via Folco Portinari, and this is where the hospital would have been. And what was fascinating also was the artists were deeply connected as well with the medicine of Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. The Arte dei Medici e Speziali, Dante was a member of it by 1295, and then later would be founded the Compagnia di San Luca in 1339. And this is part of the chapel, which is in the Santissima, with paintings by Vasari, where he shows the Madonna being portrayed by San Luca, St. Luke. And in the book on Santa Maria Nuova, let us admit, Laura, on the book on Santa Maria Nuova, there's a splendid essay by Esther Diana on how the artists were placing in the rooms frescoes of the story of the Gospels of Jesus, and also the crucifixion, nativity, etc., etc., to show that the healing of the patients was both spiritual and physical. And it was also carried out in the hospital, the autopsies, the anatomical discussions of the human body, which was made in this way sacred. Jesus in our midst in Jerusalem, as you see in the Vita Nova. Here we see Leonardo Buti in 1583, showing the two patrons of Florence, John the Baptist and Mary. And then this detail here, which you see enlarged here, of Bernardo Tolomei and Sant'Egidio with the patients. And here underneath the bed, you see the urinals and so forth, the chamber pots and so on. What's fascinating is that the discussions of the statutes. Yes, right, I'm on Zoom now. Can you? Okay, try to contact me on Zoom. Bless you. Ciao, ciao, Sunde. Okay, bye. And what is fascinating is here you see the work of the hospital being carried out in the midst of sacred scenes. It's collapsing time, as I've been explaining the art does. Here we get Hugo van der Vos. I've made a mistake in his spelling of his name. It should be Hugo. Showing the nativities, commissioned by Thomas Portinari. Again, I've misspelled it. who is a descendant of Folco Portinari. He commissions it in Bruges for Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. So you get Flemish painting in Florence. This is now in the Uffizi, but it was at the altar of the Church of Santa Gidio at the center of Santa Maria Nuova Hospital in 1475. And here you see the baby naked, born, buried on the earth, which is carrying out also the vision of Santa Brigida di Spezia, St. Brigida of Sweden, who said when she was in the cave in the grotto in Bethlehem that she saw this. But imagine the birth of a child in the filth of a stable, in the most extremely unhygienic situation, but at the same time the reverencing. And this was a sense of Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, that it was open to all the pilgrims, the poor. It's no longer so. I was there in the emergency room and watching that those people who lacked documents, their identification documents, their passports, could not receive medical attention. But that was not the original intent of Monatessa or Folco Portinari. It was to welcome all, especially the poor. And in this cemetery, many of the very poor from the Grigioni, from Switzerland, died in Santa Maria Nuova Hospital as paupers and were then buried here at the cost of the church. In the rooms of the patients would be these beautiful crucifixes and extremely observant of the anatomy of the naked body. There was the reverences of the naked body by Florentines as in the image of God. And I love this one of Pietro Gerini, the resurrection. It's partial, it's been damaged, it's 1385. But here you see Christ rising out of the tomb, the soldiers sleeping at the base of it. Michelangelo and the Misericordia, he is noticing and this is the sculpture that used to be in the Duomo where it should be. Michelangelo designed it for his own tomb, and he put his own self-portrait as Joseph of Arimathea or Nicodemus carrying the dead as a Misericordia worker. I sketched this is my drawing, holding my baby, my oldest child who is now dead of sarcoma, in my arms, in the Duomo, listening to the sermon being preached against La Dolce Vita. And also Leonardo da Vinci, he was studying anatomy at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital in 1507, 1508. And here we see his drawings, obstetrical drawings of a baby in the womb. And this aspect of sculpture is going to be continued by the woman Felicie de Fauveau, the women Edmonia Lewis, who's part Native American and Black, Harriet Helsmer, Amalia Dupré. My friend is Amalia Chadi Dupré, who's part of that family. William Wetmore Story, who was commissioned by Frederick Douglass to do the tomb for Theodore Parker in our cemetery, and Hiram Powers, who does the Greek slave. Niccolo Stenoni is Danish who came to Florence, and in 1666 to 1675, he was practicing medicine for the poor and also studying geology, then converted to Catholicism from Lutheranism and became very much a missionary in Europe, dying abroad, but the Grand Duke brought his body back to be buried at San Lorenzo. And he's now Richard Parker. Thank you, Richard Parker. I've just been talking about Theodore Parker. Richard Parker is in Boston and is descendant of Theodore Parker. And also, this is the medallion which was given to us because of our work with the Roma, restoring the English cemetery. The Roma had been slaves in Europe for centuries longer than had been Africans in America. And I was very honored that Maria Francesca Galifanti had us come to San Lorenzo, and in Niccolo Stenoni's chapel we were given this medal. What is fascinating is the major study, cutting-edge study in Santa Maria Nuova Hospital was obstetrics. And this had been carried out all along from the oblate, the nuns who were not under vows, who were quasi-independent, formed by Monadessa 700 years ago to deal with the women patients. But this is what was like in the period of the Enlightenment with the doctors, male doctors, who did not wash their hands and causing often the women to die of puerperal fever from septicemia. They were very good at knowing how to do forceps and the positions of the fetus and so forth, but they lacked the sense of hygiene, despite the resistance, enormous resistance to, for instance, Ignaz Semmelweis, but also there was the splendid Italian Domenico Chiara, who published in Florence his book on the need for hygiene in delivery of babies. And these are the obstetrical instruments used by Giovanni Alessandro Brambilla, and the new Careggi Hospital, separated now from Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, is in the Piazza Brambilla. And these are the wax models that were created to teach how to deal with the delivery of babies. And Florence's English cemetery, I feel, is very much involved in this story. I've already talked about the crutch, the pottery of the little cup used with the patients. Here we see the cemetery from the air. And as it was all put to weed killer. There were syringes, there were black masses, there were suicide attempts, and the tombs were vandalized. And then the Roma came and asked if they could garden, and they planted the wild irises, which are Florence's lily, and restored the tombs. And it became very profitable for its Swiss owners. And for that we were given the medal, the medallion of the Beato Niccolo Stenoni. And the cemetery is deeply involved with slavery. Elizabeth Barrett Browning of Jamaica, she is herself part black. She is from a family of slave owners, and she's bitterly opposed to slavery. Francis Trollope writes the first anti-slavery novel. Theodore Parker preaches against slavery with a loaded gun at the pulpit in Boston. And his tomb will be recommissioned, because the older one was inadequate, with the statement that he freed men from superstition and slavery. Commission of William Wetmore Story, whose biography was written by Henry James, William Wetmore Story, and his friends. And then Richard Hildreth's tomb is 2 tombs down from Theodore Parker, who wrote The White Slave, in which he showed the slave market, the separation of the children from the parents, which is still going on with my Roma families. And then there's Nadezhda de Santis. She was 15 years old, a Nubian slave. Her freedom was purchased by the uncle of Rossellini, of the Champollion Rossellini expedition to Egypt and Nubia in 1828. She is from Nubia. She dies in her 30s and is buried in this beautiful Russian Orthodox cross, because she was taken in by a family of Russians and renamed Nadezhda from Kalina, Nadezhda meaning hope. And then there's Frederick Douglass, who visited us in 11th of May, 1887. And this plaque was made by Daniel Claudio Dumitrescu, who is Roma, whose own ancestors were slaves, and then in the Holocaust. And this is Frederick Douglass's diary of his entry of his visit to the English cemetery, to the tombs of Theodore Parker, Richard Hildreth, and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, the diary now held in the US Library of Congress. I love the way this new technology can actually show us the autographic writings of the authors. And one of the reasons why Florence was more open to racial aspects is because Duke Alessandro de' Medici, the last Medici, was himself the son of a black slave. And with us is buried also Hiram Powers, who sculpted the Greek slave and the last of her tribe. He's part Native American. And the Statue of America, which was rejected by Congress before the Civil War, because America is trampling on slave chains. And this is Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem that she wrote on seeing this statue here in Florence before it was exhibited in the Crystal Palace in 1851 in their great exhibition. They say ideal beauty cannot enter the house of anger. On the threshold stands an alien image with the shackled hands, called the Greek slave, as if the sculptor meant her that passionless perfection which he lent her, shadowed, not darkened, where the sill expands, to so confront men's crimes in different lands with man's ideal sense, pierce to the center art's fiery finger, and break up ere long the serfdom of this world. Appeal, fair stone, from God's pure heights of beauty against man's wrong. Catch up in thy divine face, not alone, east griefs, but west, and strike and shame the strong. Hiram Powers always used the naked body of his own wife for his nudes, but the face is the face of the beautiful half Greek, half English Albina. And it's a wonderful poem. And what I find fascinating is that women's novels and women's poems written by women who were not allowed to own property, who were not allowed to participate in politics, who were not allowed to go to university or to study medicine, were able to change history. And then this section is on Roma and slavery. Lorenzo Bartolini created this monument to the Russian Prince Demidov and his acts of charity in Florence. It's a very beautiful sculpture. He was actually a cripple in a wheelchair. But also buried in our cemetery is the noble Joanne Cantacuzene, who was descended from emperors of Byzantium who possessed Roma slaves. And this is the condition under which the Roma lived. And still I have seen settlements here in Florence of camps for the Roma, where the rats were leaping over the rubbish dumps because the Comune refused to remove the rubbish. Actually, the Roma are very clean, but if they are not allowed access to water or rubbish removal, the situation is devastating. And this is the sculpture that Lord Leighton placed on the back of the tomb. Sir Robert didn't censor it for the broken slave shackle to honor Elizabeth Barrett Browning's work against slavery. And this is a slave poster in Romanian talking about the selling of 12 men, 10 boys, 7 women, and 3 children, the slave market. And this is my family I so love, who came and restored our cemetery. This is Vandana, who is now returned to me, looking after me while I'm in this medical crisis. And also this is Daniel. They are creating the cradle for their baby, who was going to be born the next day because the Carabinieri forced Vandana into their car, and she was absolutely terrified and went into labor prematurely. That baby, Gabriella, is now 14. She is in Liceo. She's going to be trained to be a teacher. Her school expenses are very high, so we're trying to raise money. She's the only Roma in her school, and it's sort of like the Little Rock Nine. And we so hope she's been winning prizes as a poet. And then also we had the Roma learned, because most of them were illiterate, only Daniel and Vandana were literate. And so I did alphabet school, and we were doing the restoration of the letters on the tombs. And Daniel created this plaque for Frederick Douglass. And I had the two twins from my ordination candidates, her daughters come, who were teaching, who were doing letter carving in Hastings to teach Daniel Claudio Dumitrescu and other Roma how to incise the inscriptions on marble in Florence's English cemetery. And here they are at work. This is Mihai and Daniel and Hebe and her sister. And this is Marianne, who is Nikolai's daughter. And she's writing out the plaque for Catherine MacKinnon, who was born on the island of Mull in great poverty and became the governess of the Tsar of Russia. But her tomb is lost, so we needed to place a stone with her name. And then this section is on the rights of women and children. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Margaret Fuller, Jessie White Mario, Anita Garibaldi, Mary Somerville, Ada Lovelace, Fanny and Theodore Trollope, Florence Nightingale, Christina Principessa Belgiosa, Christina Temple Bowdoin, and Sarah Guppy. These were women who were writers, who were journalists, who were running hospitals, who were wives of liberators, who were inventors of the computer, and etc. And Florence Nightingale, who copies the Oblate of Santa Maria Nuova in the Crimea to create the modern nursing order. Christina Principessa Belgioso is she's running hospitals for Garibaldi along with Margaret Fuller. And Christina Temple Bowdoin is the one who invents the keyboard for the Morse code, which becomes the keyboard for the Olivetti typewriter, which becomes the keyboard of this computer. And Sarah Guppy is she's the inventor of the Clifton Suspension Bridge. And these are women who were not allowed education, not allowed property, not allowed the vote. And they did so much to change our world. Mary Somerville, who discovers two planets and who teaches Ada Lovelace mathematics, and Ada, who works with Charles Babbage and Luigi Menabrea to invent the computer. The modern world has changed completely because of them. Meanwhile, Gian Pietro Vieussieux in the Cabinet of Vieussieux had as library member Sarah Parker Remond, who was Afro-American and abolitionist, studying at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, obstetrics, Fyodor Dostoevsky, John Ruskin, Robert Browning. But Robert told Elizabeth the women were not allowed in the library, which wasn't true. Medicine in the English cemetery. Dr. Thomas Southwood Smith had Elizabeth Barrett Browning write Cry of the Children, and Francis Trollope write Michael Armstrong, Factory Boy. And that changed English law to prohibit children working from under the age of 12. However, my great-grandfather, James Roberts, walked barefoot across the moors to Bradford to work in the mills at 11, after having been taught by Patrick Bronte in Haworth, where he had grown up. And he then became the owner of Saltaire. He was first a manager at 18, learning Russian fluently, teaching himself, sharing, trading wool and cloth with St. Petersburg, then buying Saltaire, which is now UNESCO World Heritage Site, which he doubled in size using Italian architecture he saw in St. Petersburg. And he bought Haworth Parsonage for the nation and was made a baronet and almost a veto peer. And I'm very proud of him because he was extremely handsome and really splendid person. But rich families, Nuova rich families like his, are also very dysfunctional. And so we've got lots of tragedies in our family as well. But anyway, these are all the doctors in the English cemetery. So David Dumbreck, who was the head of the Crimean hospitals over Florence Nightingale, Dr. Bartolomeo Ottocini, who was Garibaldi's doctor, the Vicomte de Henri de Bellinay, who was a French aristocrat who had to escape to London and practice medicine in Wimpole Street after the French Revolution, and so forth. William Wilson is Elizabeth Barrett Browning's doctor, as well as Dr. Gresanowski, and so on. There's a whole list of them. Thomas Silvestre, who was from India, was called in at a duel in Bagni di Lucca, and so on. The wonderful stories about them. James Annesley writes a huge book on fevers in tropical countries and so on. And they all end up here in this small cemetery. And especially the last, Lorenzo Capet, Joseph Sampson Gamgee, and Joseph Lister are all connected with Lorenzo Capet's English wife, who dies following childbirth. This is Dr. Bartolomeo Odicini. I love this picture, this photograph. This is in Uruguay, Montevideo, where he was treating Anita Garibaldi and her family. Giuseppe Garibaldi had such integrity, he didn't accept any money for his liberation work. So his family were dying of starvation. And Bartolomeo Odicini was helping them, but lost one of the daughters as a result of the famine. And he also treated Garibaldi, one of the doctors, after the Battle of Aspromonte, when Garibaldi's leg was badly injured. And then Sir David Dumbreck, his widow, gives to the sculptor for his tomb the images, the medals of the Crimea. And Sir Robin Dumbreck gave me the photographs of these medals to share on the web. And then these are the deaths from unwashed hands following childbirth in our cemetery. Fanny Holman Hunt, the wife of William Holman Hunt, who paints 1866. Louise Leconte, who does her own self-portrait in 1847, dies of puerperal fever. This portrait is in the Uffizi and in the Pitti Palace and the Corridoio Bessariano. And the medallion here is given to her by Pauline Bonaparte. Her father was painting miniatures of the Bonaparte family. And then this is Sarah McCalmont, who also dies following childbirth. She stepped straight out of a Jane Austen novel in 1836. And her descendants came and described how her desolate husband, the baby lived, and all of these babies did live for these free women. And they were the husband was having to push the carriage up over the Alps with the baby and the nurse in it. And then these are the illnesses that we find in Florence's English cemetery. Those following childbirth: Emma Gamgee, Capet, Fanny Holman Hunt, Sarah McCalmont, Selina Garinet, Maria Mercadante, Louise Leconte, Kunis, Orazia Augusta Robley Borghese, and many others. Tuberculosis: Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Leontiev Levitsky, Jonas Callender, Countess Charlotte Bowes-Lyon, Ellis William de Lissa, Georgiana Clementina Sloper, Theodore Trollope, Beecher Trollope, etc. Diphtheria: Mary Spencer Stanhope, Alice Charles Cottrell, John Logan Campbell. Malaria: Arthur Hugh Clough. Cholera: Robina Wilson, Catherine Jane Penfold Baroncelli. Cancer: Cornelia Loring. She had the two doctors that were shared with Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Wilson and Gresanowski. Tetanus: Louisa Catherine Adams Coon. She's the sister of Henry Adams, of the Education of Henry Adams, who describes her dying in the chapter Chaos in that book. Anthrax: Henry Arnold Savage Landor. I was to supervise the burial of his remains that were brought down from Porto Sante, and they arrived without the documents. So I went back to Porto Sante to get the documents, to find that we had been handling the box with the bones of someone who had anthrax. So this job is pretty risky. And I find myself, having to deal with things like anthrax and trees falling just where I had been a few minutes before and so forth. And then there were suicides like James Craigie and Adelaide de Lissa. But also the story of medicine. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu learned from the Roma in Constantinople, in Istanbul, the practice of inoculation with smallpox and brought that back to England. Edward Jenner then discovered that it was safer to do it with cowpox. Ignaz Semmelweis was the one who observed that the men coming in from carrying out autopsies, delivering babies, resulted in a very high mortality rate, whereas the female midwives in the other ward did not. Louis Pasteur sort of blew Semmelweis's theories apart with his idea of the microbes. Domenico Chiara was extremely important, and publishing from Parma, publishing in Florence, his treatise where he made the same observations that Semmelweis had, that women delivering babies resulted in far less mortality than did the work of men delivering babies without washing their hands, women tending to be cleaner. And then Joseph Lister, who's also involved with the Gamgee and Capet families on the sense of antiseptic. So we have come a long way. And women in medicine. Principessa Belgiosa was not allowed she was allowed to run hospitals along with Margaret Fuller. So also was Jessie White Mario. Jessie White Mario applied to medical school many times, was always turned down. Florence Nightingale instituted, according to the Oblate model, modern nursing. Octavia Hill was more interested in the sanitation of housing for the poor, and she's the granddaughter of Thomas Southwood Smith and raised by him. While Dr. James Barry pretended he was a man and was actually a woman, and became the head of the military hospitals for Britain, and had already carried out a cesarean operation in South Africa, which was successful because he always washed his hands before surgery. And then this is a tomb which I find so sad. This is the tomb for the Emma Gamgee, who is the daughter of this family connected with Lister. Her husband, also a doctor, Capet, and one of our members of our association was descended from her, but she did not die because of unwashed hands, but because of the complications of the twin delivery. Next, we come to Sarah Parker Remond. I discovered Sarah Parker Remond partly in this way. Marilyn Richardson came to ask if she was buried in our cemetery. And I said I would try to find her, but she wasn't here. Now, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote The Rights of Women. Her daughter, Mary Shelley, was painted twice by Richard Rothwell, who is my ancestor. And this is in the National Portrait Gallery, and this is in the Bodleian Library by Richard Rothwell. Let's see if I can go back. Right, okay. And so I was checking in the Rome Protestant Cemetery in the old ledger of the 19th century. And on the same page, I saw Sarah Parker Remond along with Richard Rothwell. So I immediately wrote to my friend Marilyn Richardson saying, she's in Rome, she's not in Florence. And this is Sarah Parker Remond. She was a friend of Frederick Douglass. She was preaching, she was lecturing against slavery in America and then in England. And in England, she was friends with Giuseppe Garibaldi and Giuseppe Mazzini, who were in exile. She was studying medicine and also classical literature and so forth at the University of London, at the college which was formed for women. And she was sort of part of this group that were doing, you know, Call the Midwife, nuns, the All Saints nuns. And I've stayed in their convent in Margaret Street. It's absolutely beautiful, very pre-Raphaelite. Rossetti's sister, Maria Rossetti, was one of its nuns, and she wrote a brilliant commentary on Dante. And so the Marilyn Richardson and her friend Mayor set up the fund to create this plaque in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. And then I was hoping to do one here for Santa Maria Nuova, but it got rejected, and very soundly rejected, saying, oh, she was only a nurse, she didn't study medicine. Whereas she had been studying in the College of Medicine, University of London, and also in Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. And also in the documents in the book on Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, it explains that one of the women, the widows of the Oblate, actually was the obstetrician and trained completely to do so. And then these are the letters. This is the letter that Sarah Parker Remond writes, asking to be admitted to study at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. And here is the examination results. She's admitted as Negra d'America, and so on. She is abilitata in 1868, having entered in 1866. And what I found fascinating actually was being a patient in Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. I hadn't really realized that the Oblate still exist from 700 years ago. Here are Monotessa's Oblate, and they were running the wards and doing everything. And they create this lovely atmosphere in this hospital. This is the fresco where you even see the cat in the chair at the Nativity. And in the front of it, you see three of the Oblate sisters. Many of them now come from the Third World, and they've spread all over the globe. And then this is the building by the Innocenti, right here, where Sarah Parker Remond was actually doing her obstetrics practice. And obstetrics theory was taught at Santa Maria Nuova Hospital with the help of wax models, now exhibited in the Grand Duke Leopold's Speculum Museum and also the Galileo Museum. The practicum was taught at the maternity clinic by the Innocenti for the unmarried and poor women. Women legitimately married were treated in their homes by male doctors and their students. This was Sarah Parker Remond's obstetrical training in Florence. And this is the actual building where this was being carried out. And it's right around the corner here. And so you can see there. So this was the plaque that Daniel created for this, but it got objected. We've now put the missing comma here because they said, oh no, those dates should be the birth and the death dates. And that's not correct. Also, she couldn't have studied medicine because she was only a nurse. Also, you can't say abolitionista because that just means anti-alcohol. It doesn't mean anti-slavery. So this plaque has been thrown out, but another one has been made with a machine. This was done by hand, and each letter costs 20 euro to do by hand. So that's 2,000 euro. So we've thrown away 2,000 euro. The other one was much cheaper because it was done by a machine. It's really quite ugly, and they got our lily all wrong. I don't know why they put our lily on it, because that's our association of Arianello Associazione for the Noble English Descendants, the International Scholars, and the Roma. So the Roma got excluded. But here we see Daniel doing the one for Frederick Douglass. And here we see the letter, the diary of Frederick Douglass, describing him coming to Rome now and finding Sarah Parker Remond, now older, elderly, the woman doctor in Rome. And he's so delighted to meet her again because he had known her many years ago back in, and her family in Salem. And these are the two books I've used. Santa Maria Nuova attraverso i secoli by Giancarlo Landini, with also its blended essays by Esther Diana, describing the importance of art and healing medicine together. And then also Alex Johnson gave me this beautiful book, God's Hotel by Victoria Sweet. She is a woman doctor who was organizing, helping this hospital in the Bay Area in San Francisco, with the sense of it being medicine as healing. In France, you see the Dieu, Hôpital de Dieu, God's hotels. These were the origins of hospitals were for treating poor pilgrims and so forth. The idea of accepting everyone, the poor as well as the rich. And in fact, in my cemetery, the poor die in the hospitals, the rich die at home. So I just wanted to point out that our work, we call it From Graves to Cradles, the concept of solidarity, women, slaves, the outsider as being needing to be included, to combat poverty, slavery, war, genocide with love. L'amor che muove il sole, l'altre stelle. All you need is love, the Beatles. The love of God, of neighbor, of enemy, which is my book on Dante and his circle, Brunetta Latina. And finally, Alcmaeon, Aristotle's physician, saying man dies because he cannot join the ending to the beginning. So we join the beginning to the ending, the crutch, the pottery from Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, with its form of the Jewish and Franciscan letter Tau, which appears also on the crown of the Madonna of Mercy in the Megala. And thank you. And now we can do the stop share and everyone can join in and talk. And thank you so much for all of you being present. Did it make sense? And I'm so grateful, especially for Luca Borghi being here, because he showed up a few days ago in the English cemetery trying to track down what was going on at Santa Maria Nuova. Did explain it.
Yeah. No, you explained it very well. Right. It was very interesting. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so
I'm
much.
hearing impaired, so if you could all speak up, that I would appreciate that. This computer doesn't really do sound very well. And I'm so grateful for your presence, Luca. And
can you hear me?
Yes,
can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Okay. No, I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me to this very beautiful seminar, and thanks again for having me in the cemetery some weeks ago. It was I'm telling everybody about the visit I made to the Florence cemetery, and then I liked very much your talk today. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Right.
And as you know, I want to work a bit on the physicians' tombs. You allowed me to photograph when I was in Florence. So I will tell you what I can find. I wanted to ask you, for example, how could you ascertain the causes of death of many people you mentioned from cholera or...
Often they are in the records, because, for instance, all the Russians were recorded in the Russian Orthodox Cross Church, which was also the civil service for St. Petersburg. Plus the English burials were also recorded in the Guildhall Library. And very often they talk about the causes of death, plus from the biographies we know, and so on. Actually, I feel that Elizabeth did not die of TB. She died of an overdose administered by her husband of laudanum. And because there's not the symptoms of TB and so forth. But it's quite clear what the different causes of death can be from the documentation around that. And I was hoping that there was a graduate student, a Florentine graduate student, who would work on this, but she backed out because she didn't have the languages to be able to cope with it, because these documents are in so many different languages.
Oh, sure.
But I feel it's one of the things I find very difficult is the very poor from Switzerland, because there's almost a charnel heap for them. They were dying like flies of TBC from the Grigioni, because they were so poor when they came to Florence. They were like the way the Roma are now. They were that wave of immigrants back in the 19th century. And they were one of the ones doing the coffee shops, the cafeteria and so forth. So it's a fascinating study sociologically, because the cemetery is filled with serfs and slaves and servants and nobles and king's sons and so on. It's a wild mixture, very international. And it's sort of a litmus test of what was going on in Europe in the 19th century. And also a document for us today, I think, if that makes sense. I think we've got so much to learn. I mean, my moment of panic when I realized I was dealing with anthrax and so forth. Right. Okay. Could Richard Parker say something? Because Richard Parker is descended from, well, part of Theodore Parker's family.
Well, first, Julia, as always, it's just a pleasure to join these conversations with you. And I can't tell you how much I appreciated the conversation today, which covered both the hospital and also its relationship to the cemetery in a rich and expansive way. And I was particularly moved by your description of the condition of the Roma and the role that the Roma have played in the restoration of the cemetery. And again, the ongoingness of racial discrimination and poverty.
Yes.
And not its inescapability, because I don't believe either of those is a permanent condition of humankind, but still the fact that it endures is painful, very painful. But again, I think there's a book here of some great length of
right. There is a book. It's called White Silence, from Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnet. And it describes every single burial in the cemetery. And its second to last chapter is all of the lost tombs, because we've only got half of the tombs of all of the burials. And the others are all of those poor Swiss and others, like people like Catherine McKinnon and so on. And so we tell their story too, because everyone's story needs to be told. Then the final chapter is on how the Roma restored the cemetery. But I haven't managed to get a publisher for it. It's on the web. I published it on the web electronically. But I would love, for instance, perhaps Harvard could publish it.
Have you approached university publishers in the US?
No, I haven't dared try.
Haven't dared try? Oh, well,
yes.
Maybe we should talk offline then.
It's so well documented, you know, from all of the archival material. And we photographed every single tomb, measured every single tomb, given all of the obituaries, the archival entries here by the Swiss, and the tomb inscriptions. So it's a splendid way of doing in depth in a small space in 50 years, a kind of what the Italians call sondaggio, a sounding of not only Italy but Europe, of the whole world. And I think it could be really valuable if we could get it published.
Well, I think if Père Lachaise can have its own publishing, certainly the English Cemetery ought to make a good run at that that market segment.
Yes. I've never seen Père Lachaise. I would love to, especially Abelard and Eloise. That's why I've got a cradle in our library, because of Abelard and Eloise's discussion of that. Right. Kirsten is Quaker in Florence, and what was your impression of it?
Of your presentation, Julia?
Yes, what your impression of it? Did it make sense?
It made a lot of sense. Thank you ever so much. It's lovely to see everyone online. It's really interesting because I live in Florence, and so what I found was that I come and visit, and we'll have really interesting chats with Julia. But
I can't
what
barely
was,
hear you. If you could speak up.
I'll try and
Yes.
speak a bit louder.
Mhm.
I found your presentation really, really interesting because even though I'm based in Florence and I will see you at least once a month, and usually we'll have interesting conversations, and every time I go, I discover something else about the cemetery. But I found this presentation has really filled in a lot of the gaps in terms of bringing various names together, and I just found it really, really interesting. Also, I found out a lot more about you, Julia, and about some of your personal links,
Yeah.
which I always find really interesting.
Yeah.
But it's just incredible because it paints a picture of what was happening in Florence and where the movements of certain social classes, and although those people were from very privileged backgrounds, they had fascinating lives, and I find that very interesting. Sometimes I find that period of history more interesting than perhaps the Renaissance period, that of course Florence is more famed for. So yeah, thank you very much. It was really interesting.
Yes, we've been having Quaker meetings in our library here in Florence, in the cemetery. And Vandana has actually counted all of the books. We've got 7,411 books in the library. And we do run an underground railroad because social assistance steals the children of the Roma and puts them into care, thinking that if they can break the culture and forbid them their language and their families, that they will be undoing the poverty. But in fact, that does the opposite. So we have worked to try to give literacy and to keep the families together instead of breaking them up, which is also what slavery had done. And we also give work contracts. We try to do everything legally. And because no one will rent to the Roma, they live with me and they look after me, and they are absolutely wonderful. They're the best house guests I've ever had, and so forth. Peter, Nick Peters in Belgium, do you have a comment? You're the pre-Raphaelite amongst us.
I wondered who that might be.
Right. Okay. Nick, are you going to be shy? I don't think are you muted? Yes, you're muted. Could you unmute? Right.
Right, that should be better.
That's better, yes.
I wasn't thinking about the pre-Raphaelites. I was thinking about you mentioning one of my compatriots, Hugo van der Goes. Hugo van der Goes.
Right. Yeah, who I misspelled, yes.
Well, you actually spelled his name right, but you spelled his Christian name the French way,
Right,
and
right.
his surname the Dutch
Yes.
way. So that is really Belgian, a combination of both languages.
Yes.
But what I love about that painting is that it influenced the Italian painter
Yes.
whom I love most, Ghirlandaio.
Yes.
And I didn't know that that painting was at the Santa Maria Nuova hospital. So thank you for telling me that, because ever since I was an art history student here in Antwerp at the Royal Academy, that painting has been very, very special to me because it had such an important influence internationally.
Yes.
And I also used it in a lecture I gave a few years ago at the National Gallery in London about the influence of Flemish painting on the pre-Raphaelites, especially flower symbolism. because as you showed us, there is quite a lot of flower symbolism in
Yes,
that painting by Hugo.
yes. It is a
So
splendid
a
painting,
bit
yes.
of pre-Raphaelites after all.
Mhm. Yes. Thank you, Nick. Yes.
And thank you, Julia.
Thank you. And Laura, do you have a comment?
Well, I'm just happy to have heard your presentation. And since my friend was in that hospital when I was there last fall, I know
Yes, right.
exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. No, Julia, thank you. Thank you for all of that. You pulled a lot of things together that I've heard you talk about in other settings. And this was wonderful, a wonderful overview of all of that. So thank you.
Thank you,
Can you hear
Laura.
me, Julia?
Yes, I can. Yes. Mhm.
Okay, good. Okay.
Mhm. Right. Now let's ask Alex. Do you want to sum things up a bit?
I'm not summing it up, but it was just one of the richest, and I agree. Julia, I agree also, first of all, about the book. There is a book on the cemetery itself. I think the way you have linked Santa Maria Nuova and the Innocente and the cemetery is just sort of breathtaking. And I hope in it, the cemetery book, that you have something about Santa Maria Nuova and the Innocente, because I think if you have a book about a cemetery, it's where people end up dead. But the question is what was the journey from the beginning? But something I think you've done here that's so wonderful is you've begun with the 7 acts of mercy in the Bigallo. And you begin with, when I was sick, you came to visit me. But really, a through line through all of today is one of the other acts of mercy, which is taking in the stranger. And I think you've shown both the good and the bad ways that it continues, that Florence had one of the largest, most intensive building of hospitals in Europe
Yes.
early on. Just the sheer square meters of it and the number of hospitals. But so many of those, and if you've alluded to this, came from the fact of you had pilgrims and travelers coming through, some going to Rome or to Jerusalem, and needed not just hospitals, but needed all sorts of civic charity, essentially. And these were, so they were taken in, and I think that one of the great hospitals ever, showing what you've just talked about, is in Siena, Santa Maria della Scala,
yes.
which is incredible frescoes of showing really of the 7 acts of mercy, but with the physicians, with giving out to the poor. What you've done today, though, is really showing still the underside, where you have shown the Roma, you have shown ways that the stranger is still kept as the other. And one of the reasons I sent you the book God's Hospital is because I first came across it for something in the New York Times, but also at a conference where it was doctors on narrative, and they all loved this book. But one of the things that's very clear is, at least in this country, there's only a little tiny window at the bottom of a physician's chart, electronic charts, that says anything else we should know. Because once you've gone over the 2,000 words, there is no room to know anything else about a life. And I think that God's Hotel is so wonderful of showing a physician whose whole life was changed by having to have patients who came from the poorest hospital in Oakland, who then you start to see anyway, just the shift of taking in the stranger. So your presentation is as always has caught so many fertile grounds here. I think we're all finding things.
Yes. I do recommend this book. It's Victoria's Suite, God's Hotel, and it is absolutely splendid, but also very sad at the ending, when the whole principle of the hospital is changed and modernized. And it's
Well,
sort of, yes.
It
And-
begins,
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
modeled on Hildegard's,
Right.
like a monastery where patients could stay
Yes.
for a year and a half.
Mhm.
And then they built a new hospital. Oliver Sacks said that this is for him, was for him, one of the most important books that any doctor could read.
Yes, yes, I agree. And also, what I found absolutely fascinating is that there was one point when I ended up with syncope and was started off by ambulance to Santa Maria Nuova Hospital. And in the ambulance, the person who was a woman was telling me what was going wrong with my heart. I was very grateful to get the information. But when I got into the emergency ward, the male doctor was absolutely furious. He said she had no right to tell you that. Only he could do so. And what I found fascinating this time, when I ended up in Santa Maria Nuova Hospital, was that so many of the nurses were young men. And they were changing the panolini, the diapers of the elderly ladies, which whereas many of the doctors were women. So I think we're going through an enormous paradigm shift. And almost now with all of these various tons of appointments that I've got, almost all of the doctors I've seen are women, and brilliant women and very caring women. And I think we're going in a rather good direction. But I am so grateful for all of the participants tonight. And if there are any more comments, please make them, and then we will end this. Comment?
Julia.
Yes, Phil. Phil's on Iceland. He's my former student.
And
yes.
by the way, most of the publishers that I work with now are women. Almost all of
Yes,
them.
right.
Women.
It is a paradigm shift. Right.
I just wanted to say I came across a description of the Protestant cemetery recently in a book by Parsons Brainerd Cogswell, who it was published in 1880. Cogswell was the mayor of Concord, and he married the daughter of Parker Pillsbury. And Parker Pillsbury, the great abolitionist, he was a friend of Sarah Parker Remond. And he traveled around Europe, and he wrote a little description of the Protestant cemetery. He focuses mainly on Theodore Parker, and has some very fine things to say about Theodore Parker. In fact, most of the description is about Theodore Parker. And Richard Hildreth and Joel T. Hart, the sculptor. And he also mentions the grave of Elizabeth Barrett Browning as well. And it's a very nice little, it's only 3 pages.
Do send it to me, please.
I'll
Yes, it
send
sounds
it to you.
fascinating. Yes.
And it's on archive.org online. And if anybody's interested, it's pages 243 to 45. You can find the book. Did I mention the title is what's the title? Glints from Over the Water by Parsons Brainerd Cogswell, and very nice description of the cemetery.
Right. Thank you. Right.
Briefly. Okay.
Right. Are there more comments? I realized.
Julia, can you hear me?
Sue,
Julia,
yes, Sue. Right.
I just wanted to thank you, and I'm so glad you're okay. And I appreciate everybody's input. And
yeah.
you know, I'm getting to feel like I actually can walk around there, and I just, you know, I've been learning about this cemetery for so long. One day I want to go in person. Okay, thank you, Julia. Continue feeling well. Okay, bye.
Okay, right. Any more comments? Richard Parker, do you have your hand up? I think you're muted.
There I am. I'm unmuted. I was just patiently crossing my hands in contemplation of a wonderful discussion.
Right. So I think then we will end for tonight, and the recording will be available. And I am really grateful for everyone's participation, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Julia.
Thank you,
Thank
Julia.
you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Julia.
Thank you.
Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank-
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Good night. Mhm.
Bye. Good night.
Right.